A very warm welcome to Day 4 of International Leadership Week 2021. I'm Doug Strycharczyk, Chief Executive at AQR International, and I will be your host for today's session, which is Leadership Attending to the Human Needs. Now, leadership and what is good leadership practice has been at the top of the agenda for as long as I've been in the business of people in organisational development. And believe me, that's a very long time. And it's at the top of the agenda for a very good reason. However, to quote one observer, leadership thinking is chaotic. There are billions of words written on the subject, but often they can confuse rather than clarify. As a practitioner, I value those times when someone can take a complex notion and translate it into its essential elements, bringing an elegant simplicity to the complexity. Now, to explore this subject further, I'm delighted to be joined by our guest, Andrew Stotter-Brooks. I've had the privilege of watching Andrew work, and I know that he is someone who does focus on and attend to the essence of leadership practice. Andrew is an experienced, innovative, and award-winning learning and development professional with a track record of organisational development, performance evaluation, employee growth, and learning optimisation. As Vice President of Learning and Development at Etihad Airways, Andrew leads the creation of innovative, leading-edge learning solutions to support the development, growth, and performance of Etihad's 24,500 global team members. Andrew is recognised and trusted for the quality, enjoyment, and depth of his delivery with his experience, which comes from a variety of business sectors, including commercial, finance, technological, design, hospitality, retail, travel, leisure, and of course now aviation. So without any further delay, I'm delighted to hand over to Andrew.
Well, Doug, first of all, thank you very much for such a glowing recommendation and introduction, and I'll send you the fiver later today. Fantastic. So yeah, so first of all, the most important thing, guys, when I'm speaking is that you are absolutely invited to ask me any question on anything we're discussing. Obviously, in the session, outside the session, please reach out to me. Fairly large profile in LinkedIn as well, which is really, really important. I'm just going to move my slides forward just a little bit because I want to just think about that particular quote there. This quote really touches me in a variety of ways, and it's really about the power of the individual in that leadership role. And of course, we talk a lot in leadership roles about I suppose the dichotomy of leadership, and there's kind of four dichotomies, really, four kind of challenges that I think leaders are facing every single day, and it's becoming much more complex as we move, particularly through the recent sort of pandemic, and as we're kind of like trying to tackle that piece around communication and interaction and developing our team members. Of course, those dichotomies for me, it's that piece around, do I act as the individual? Do I act as the team player, as the leader? Do I act as the Lord? Do I dictate to the team, or do I act as the servant to the team? We hear those expressions used regularly when we're discussing leadership. Do I kind of invade and force my ideas and my concepts onto my team, or do I have complete inclusion and get everyone's input and idea in that? And are we going to be specifically going after a particular task, a specific goal, or are we going to be very diffuse in what we're trying to do as well? So these are really, really important topics. And I suppose for me, I spent a lot of time kind of discussing and thinking about that. And because of my background, and particularly now the organisation that I work with, we are incredibly diverse as an organisation. I'm going to just share a quick picture with you on the screen now, which I think is useful. So we've really kind of like settled into two kind of key areas of focus as an organisation. The first one, really, we talk a lot about what we would call our human doing. And of course, human doing for EAG, Etihad Aviation Group, the human doing is how I fly the plane. It's how I check the guest in, the guest service agent. It's how I, complete my safety drills as a member of the cabin crew or the flight crew. These are obviously critical component parts of our job. And as an organisation, I don't want to belittle the idea that doing is absolutely critical. But as we kind of move forward and as leadership evolves within our organization and of course organizations around the world, it's really more than that. It's now the important thing for me is, as well as the doing or the human doing, it's also about the human being. And we've really been designing and developing as much as we can the support around how we help the human interaction with our customers, with our guests, with each other, with our teams, because we genuinely believe that the more we have a human being approach to the way we work with people, the more impactful we become, not only just in front of our guests and our customers, but also in front of our other team members. So developing that human side of leadership is absolutely critical for me. So we have a nice simple model. We talk about knowing, doing and being. We have a very, very simple structure. Now we've been working very much on simplifying and making everything very, very clear for our team members, particularly in their growth. We talk a lot about what an individual would need to know when they are going to be impactful or successful at work. We talk a lot about what they would need to do. That's the translation of the knowledge. So I have this information, this knowledge. Personally, my view on knowledge is that it's relatively easy to acquire. You know, I can Google most things these days. So that piece around knowing things is relatively simple. Where the big challenge is for me is more about how I take that knowledge and I apply and use that knowledge in the organization to serve the guest or my team. And there's two things about that I'd like to kind of talk about over the next few minutes, and then we'll kind of move into what I think human needs, or human beings need from us as leaders, and we'll focus really much on that in the next 15 or 16 minutes. So let's have a look at that doing piece then. So for me, there's two things with doing. The first thing is, obviously it's much easier if an employee, a team member understands that, okay, so I know this, but actually what does that translate? How would I demonstrate that I know that in front of a guest, in front of a team member, in front of a leader, when I'm delivering a presentation or a coaching session or performance management session, whatever it might be. So the whole piece around knowing and doing is critical. But I think for me, one of the most important things here is actually leaders understanding what good looks like from a particular behavior. Because I suppose as I have been going through my career, one of the things I find quite regularly is that we come into contact with leaders, managers. They're very different populations, very different types of individual, by the way, but we come into contact with those individuals, and often the leader or the manager isn't particularly clear about what they would expect the team member to be delivering, and there's no kind of like clear agreement between the leader and the employee about kind of what good looks like. And of course, because there's no clarity around what the employee should be doing and what the leader should be measuring or the manager should be measuring, that leads to lots and lots of ambiguity, frustration from both the employee and from, of course, the manager as well. And there's also a certain amount of embarrassment that's involved in that as well, because if you think about it, leaders, traditionally they believe they shouldn't have the answer, they should know everything. That's a major area of concern for me. We're very, very keen to praise leaders and managers who say, do you know what, Andrew, I don't know the answer to that question. So when someone is honest enough and authentic enough to actually tell us that they don't know the answer, and they're not really sure about a particular skill or behavior, then it's really, that for me is a massive starting point in their journey as a leader. So we have what an employee would need to know, and we measure, of course, against that knowledge. We have a clear, defined structure around how the application of that knowledge is important to the organization. That's the do. And then, of course, finally, we have a huge piece around the be. So we have knowing, doing, and being. Being is the ultimate for me. So we measure being in our organization as an expert. So a being for me is actually understanding why it's important to know and why it's important to do something. So what we do know is that when an employee is able to explain why we have a policy, a procedure, why we approach a task in a particular way, it becomes much, much easier. And of course, the empowerment of the employee is absolutely massive. I'm going to distill that down into 4 very simple messages for you over the next 15 minutes or so. And of course, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, what I would really encourage you to do is to kind of reach out and ask questions. Of course, we can answer those questions with Doug in the session today, or of course you can reach out in the other platforms that we have available for you. But I really encourage you to do that. Love to engage in those conversations. So the first and probably the most important thing is actually how we acknowledge other human beings. You know, this is a very, very, very emotional conversation. We've been wearing face masks for 2 years now, haven't we? Or, you know, almost 2 years at least. And definitely where I live in this part of the world, it's mandatory. In fact, it's a legal requirement for me to wear a face mask when I'm out and about in any facility. And that's a problem because a lot of our team will say, well, how does this person know that, you know, how do you know that the team member's smiling? But we can know that, and the ability of leaders to acknowledge the people around them is absolutely fundamental to effective leadership. If a person, a leader, a manager, an employee walks past another person and they don't acknowledge them, it's a very, very negative experience. So we focus very much on mechanisms and ways that we can encourage team members and leaders and managers to acknowledge each other in that kind of interaction around the business. Of course, it's critical that we ask them to acknowledge our guests. We have a program called MAOS, Mastering the Art of Service, and a huge part of that is how we go about acknowledging people in incredible amounts of detail. It's absolutely fundamental to what we're trying to do. So that's the acknowledge piece. The second piece that we really want to do is about really understanding that it's critical and human beings expect to be respected. So as well as being acknowledged, it's actually about are you showing me that you respect me? And we discuss in lots of detail about how we can show our respect for other people. We have huge programs around diversity and inclusion and equity across the organization. It's very, very important that we show our respect and we help people understand what that actually looks like and why that's so important to the organization and the success of the organization. Then, of course, a skill that's massively underutilized, and that's this piece around listening. It's about hearing. So human beings, they have a strong need to be heard. And too often what we find is that employees don't have the opportunity. I've been at a forum today, I've been at a conference today, and we've been working with our team members, many hundreds of team members. We've been discussing the art of listening, the art of hearing, the art of asking questions, and enabling people to actually understand the basic skills that are required to listen. It's something that I think these days, particularly, definitely I have 2 children in their early 20s. They've been brought up using screens, and so they almost need to relearn those skills. So helping people really understand the importance of hearing each other. And of course, we talk a lot about hearing with our eyes because predominantly, as you know, human beings speak mostly non-verbally with each other. So actually helping our team members, helping our leaders understand the importance of actually being very present in conversations and listening and disengaging from devices is critical. So we have acknowledge, we have this piece around respecting each other, we have this piece around really hearing and listening to our team members, and then critically we have this massive piece about remembering our team members. And I think that's an absolutely fundamental part from any leader who wants to be successful, needs to be really, really switched on around remembering their team, remembering their guest. Because when we remember people, it becomes an exceptional experience from a customer point of view, a guest point of view, but also from a team member point of view. Because we're in the business of creating relationships. We're in the business of being human. And I'm not trying to take it away from being the doing, because obviously we have human doing, but it's very much around being human in our interactions. And I just want to tell you a very, very, very quick story here, because this actually it's not an original concept, but a long, long time ago, my father taught me a very, very important lesson about remembering. Now, my dad, bless him, he's now in his late 80s. He spent his entire career as a very, very talented hairdresser, and ran many salons in the UK. And what was very, very interesting about my dad was his what appeared to be encyclopedic memory, particularly guests. Now, you'd be probably slightly alarmed, as was I, to know that he was still cutting ladies' hair in his kind of early 80s. So only he's recently given up cutting people's hair. And what's even more perhaps shocking, surprising, is actually the loyalty of the people or people's hair that he was cutting, colouring, perming, etc., etc. And I often had very, very interesting conversations with my dad around why a lady, a man, would come back to him, but in some cases, 65 years. So can you imagine the loyalty involved in coming back to a business literally every week, pretty much for 65 years? Quite staggering. And what's even more staggering about that is that my dad pretty much made his business out of that. And I remember watching my dad greeting a customer many years ago now. And as I mentioned earlier, the fascinating thing about that was the way that he seemed to know everything about this lady. I'd been sort of like sat working and sort of sat next to him for a couple of hours, and I think this was probably the third lady that came into the into his salon. And when she came in, it was unbelievable because he obviously knew so much about this lady. But what was really fascinating was that he obviously had the same experience with the previous two ladies, and of course the lady after that, he also seemed to know a lot of information about her as well, which is amazing. And what my dad taught me was a lesson that was very, very, very well received, and is very, very important for a leader. So he would always say to me, Andrew, it's very, very simple. It's about actually listening and hearing your customer, hearing your guest, hearing the human. And then actually what he did, and he always felt he was a bit of a fraud, but he would take notes on that conversation. And immediately before the next guest came in, he had an appointment book, and he would then refer to those notes. And then, of course, he would then lead on some beautiful opening questions just around what the conversation had been the week before or 2 weeks before. And of course, that created the relationship. But that relationship was much bigger than that. It was actually about loyalty. And loyalty and trust are absolutely fundamental for leaders. So actually taking people with you, having loyal teams that really, really trust you, for me, it comes from being human. Care, it's an incredibly small word, but it's really, really, really powerful. And it's a Stephen Covey quote, and I love to use it, but people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I would say that from a leader's perspective, sometimes we dismiss it because we're focused on the human doing. But I would really encourage you, if you want to be a successful leader, it's about really focusing on the human being. And quite simply, it's about really making sure that we acknowledge people. It's about respecting them. It's about hearing them. And as I've discussed, it's about remembering, because when we do those four things as leaders, it becomes incredibly powerful. And of course, it drives loyalty, it drives team, it drives the human in leadership. So it's really, really, really important that we do that. Two other kind of things just to kind of wrap up today. There's also, I tend to focus, a lot of people say to me, how do you engage your team? How do you get such high levels of engagement from members in learning with the organization? And I suppose we tend to focus, there's four areas for me. There's what I would call my four levers of engagement, of employee engagement. Two of those levers I strongly believe are kind of massively outside of my control. One of the levers I believe is very, very expensive and actually often doesn't really provide much value for money, considering the amount of money we kind of tend to pour into it. So let's just kind of unpack those four levers just briefly for you. So the two kind of parameters of engagement for me are, first of all, team members, you know, wanting to do something. So that's a really interesting thing. So a human being wanting to do something. When a human being wants to do something, it's almost impossible to stop that person. They are absolutely hell-bent on completing it. A beautiful thing. So it's a personal choice. You know, wanting to do something is a personal choice. Unfortunately, we can have this conversation with Doug in a couple of minutes. I haven't worked out a mechanism to read people's minds yet as a leader. So it's a very personal choice, wanting to do something. So we tend to say, you know what, wanting is down to the individual. Let's focus on two other critical areas. Let's look at that fourth area, which we think is expensive. Fourth area is demanding, making it mandatory that you must do this. Because when we drag people in and we force them to take learning, what we know is it's expensive. They will, of course, comply and they will come along, but actually it's about the stickiness of that learning. Are they retaining what we're helping them with? So that's a real challenge, because we can spend lots and lots of money, we can force them into training rooms, we can demand that they do it and they take a test, but the reality is learning is about helping people actually retain the information, retaining the knowledge, understanding how they demonstrate it, and actually, of course, understanding critically why it's important to do this, because as we mentioned a few minutes ago, that why piece really drives the empowerment of the employee. So I can hear you kind of thinking right now, so okay, so you've mentioned two, Andrew, but what are the other two areas? Where are the real value areas? So the first one for me, and most of our time is spent in making learning accessible. So that's the whole can piece. So can I do it? And then the second piece is, of course, we wrap the accessibility around lots and lots of kind of why you should take the journey with us. So we talk a lot about making it easy for learners to take the learning as they would prefer to take it, which is increasingly in kind of micro learning sessions. And I've been talking a lot about this recently. Lots of businesses have been sort of like reaching out and asking me about the concepts of micro learning, and it's a very interesting journey, and we'll touch on it with Doug in a couple of minutes. But when we when we first kind of hit on the idea of using a lot of micro learning in the organization, we set ourselves some kind of like standards, some kind of parameters for micro learning, and at the beginning we said we'd do about 3 minutes, so we wouldn't do any learning event that was kind of more than 3 minutes. And you may be sitting there thinking, crikey, Andrew, how could you teach anyone anything in 3 minutes? But what we now know, the data that we have so much data. With Doug in a minute if you're interested, but the data now suggests that most of our learners prefer their learning in about 60 to 70 second bite-sized chunks, which has been fascinating for us. So keeping things really simple. So again, we obviously want people to take a journey, because when they want to, they're unstoppable. We focus most of our energy around how they can, so making it accessible for learners, making it easy for them to access learning content, making it very, very, very simple for them to get it. 1 click, 2 clicks to get their information. They can use it. We don't really want them storing loads of information. Just being able to remember stuff isn't that important. It's about access to it, making it easy for them. Lots of really good tools out there to make sure that we're screening kind of like loads and loads of data and providing the most relevant data for team members so they can make the right decision in front of the guest. That's absolutely critical for us. We talk a lot about, of course, why you should do it. And of course, we try as much as we possibly can. There are some compliance stuff there, but we do try and avoid you must do it. So guys, just finally, remember, care, it's a gift that everyone can afford to give. Yeah, and would really love to kind of hear your thoughts and your comments on that as well. I'm going to wrap up there, Doug, and it'll be interesting to take the conversation into a bit of a Q&A with you.
We've got quite a few questions there, Andrew. I love the way you've described bite-sized learning. I think you've just invented nibble learning, nibbling at learning.
More than likely. I was going to just unshare my stop sharing my screen. I wonder if I'm just trying to work it out.
Okay, so our first question is from Katie Clark, who is really picked up on one of your themes. and asked, how can I make my team feel heard?
So, you know, it's about slowing down. I suppose the technique we had, I was chatting in another conference earlier today. We were talking about the importance of really coaching our team members. It's a big challenge for us. One of the big sort of measurement points that we have in the organization now is actually the understanding the importance of coaching our teams. So actually by asking questions, and it's a really interesting question. A lot of managers, a lot of leaders believe that they're the experts. And I would suggest that they're not. I was having this very interesting conversation with a very senior leader who will remain nameless. It's a couple of years ago now, and it became quite a fascinating conversation. It was about how we load aircraft, and it was a kind of like quite a casual conversation that got quite serious quite quickly. And he was complaining about the people who loaded the aircraft, and you know how they damaged the aircraft and how they're too slow and yada yada yada. And I asked him a very simple question. I said to him, who is the expert at doing this? And of course, he then told me that he was the expert in loading the aeroplane. And of course, I obviously feigned incredible shock. And I looked at him and I asked him a question, when was the last time you actually loaded an aircraft? And he looked at me, he kind of reflected on that question, and he said, about 30 years ago, Stotts. Yeah, and I said, well, that's an interesting response. So the last time you were actually doing that job was 30 years ago. You're telling me that you're the expert in doing it. I would strongly disagree, because I believe that the person loading the plane is the expert. And when was the last time you actually sat down with those boys and girls, those men and women, and actually said to them, what can we do to make it easier for you? In my previous life, we had a massive distribution center, and one of the questions that I was asked, we had a massive issue with missing sellotape. Doug, this will make you laugh, Doug. We had a massive issue in this particular distribution center of missing sellotape, and it was like tons of sellotape was just vanishing out the door, and no one could understand why all the sellotape was going missing. It was a huge distribution center. They distribute, you know, for like very luxury brands, so LV, Gucci, you know, Dior, some very high-end brands. I mean, they were pretty much strip searching you when you went in there. I mean, it was a very interesting visit, I have to say. It definitely went. I talked it up as one of the most interesting places I'd ever been to. So they've got this really high-end product, and they asked me to go and visit and try and work out where the sellotape is going. It's a very long, complicated story. But do you know why they were using so much sellotape, Doug? Because it's a funny story, this. Why would?
No, go on.
So when I walked in, I must have been inside this warehouse, and I was probably there about 40 seconds. And I looked around, and all the people who were working in the warehouse, they had sellotape wrapped around their heads. Yeah, they had it all wrapped around their heads like this. Yeah. And then out the back of their head, they had a piece of string. Yeah. And then the piece of string was attached to a box. Yeah, and they were walking around the warehouse dragging these boxes, and they were putting these like high-end handbags and high-end jewelry into these boxes that were being dragged around the warehouse. And I said, wow, that's interesting. So now we know where the sellotape goes. Have we actually considered actually asking them what they would need to be more effective in their jobs? Of course, I sat down and I said, is there anything that we can do to make your lives easier? Sir, can we have a trolley? I said, do you know what? I phoned the CEO and I said, can we get some trolleys for these guys? Because if we get some trolleys, then suddenly your sellotape mystery is going to disappear. And actually, you're going to have much more motivated, much harder working team members who want to do the job for you. At the moment, they're just trying to, they're using their genius to overcome a real challenge for them. You have to give them 10 out of 10 for effort. But it's about listening to your employees, asking the employee closest to the job what they need. Because if you do that, they will give you the answer. And honestly, guys, when you ask for that feedback, just say thank you for feedback.
So we've actually got to the end of our 30 minutes, but I think we've got enough time to take another question. We've got an interesting one from Birgitta Sjöstrand. I hope I've got that right. And I think you might be especially well qualified to deal with this. This is about any tips on leading teams scattered globally with all the different cultures. Do leaders have to change their style?
Oh gosh, it's an incredible question, and thank you very much for asking that question. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you another very quick funny little story. We have a lot of team meetings. We have a daily team meeting with my team. We're scattered all around the world, 74 different locations. So we have a regular call. It's quite a challenge because of the time difference. We tend to meet at 1 o'clock. It's a bit of a thing we do, and it's really important that we include people. Of course, once upon a time, that didn't happen. We did a lot more face-to-face kind of stuff. And once upon a time, a very simple fix, we used to buy people donuts. And we used to go, I used to go to, Krispy Kreme or Dunkin' Donuts are available. And we'd buy like 24 donuts and we'd kind of put them on the table and people would help themselves to a donut. And we'd have a conversation around what we were doing and kind of what was going on and how we could make it easier for them. And then, of course, when we went into the pandemic, I went and bought some donuts. I thought, I need to go and buy the team some donuts. That'd be a nice touch. And then suddenly, it was a nightmare, because suddenly what was the simplest thing in the world to do, buying 24 donuts, ended up being a massive logistical nightmare, because we didn't want to exclude anybody from having donuts, right? So I think you have to just really think very carefully about including people. So the more that you can communicate and the more channels that you have around your communication, Doug knows I'm a huge fan of WhatsApp. But we of course have many sort of Microsoft tools as well in the organization. But I find actually that WhatsApp is one of the most useful tools. It's a very simple tool. Everyone instantly has every bit of information. I've been in a conference today facilitating that. And the worst thing for me is if my bosses or someone very senior in the organization walks up to one of my team and says, where's Stotts today? They can instantly tell him or her where I am. It makes it much easier for the team to be very connected and to feel very included. So think about the incredible technology. I spend a lot of I send a lot of videos to my team. So I think that's a really useful thing. We have these incredible telephones now in our pockets. So recording simple video messages. There's some really good techniques we could share on that with you, but that's a really useful thing as well. So it makes it very personal by WhatsApp. You can record a message in 30-40 seconds, congratulate, say thank you to somebody via a video, and push it out to the group. It has a massive, quite profound impact. It's all about being that human being, right?
It is. I think we try one more question, because Monica Slack has very kindly said, wonderful session, thank you. And she said the aspect of human doing versus human being. Says, how do you balance it in a fast-paced environment and a results-orientated organization?
Yes, there's always going to be a focus on doing.
Yeah.
Important. So, but what we do know is that the problem with having exclusive doing focus, it's a problem, because what you tend to get is that quite abhorrent behavior. Not in every case, but you do unfortunately get certain types of managers or leaders who are they perhaps their leadership, or they tend to invade, they tend to harass, they tend to bully team members. So we obviously need to get a result. We have one of the most on-time flight performance, we're the safest airline in the world, yada. That comes from strong human doing. But also we need to encourage our leaders to develop the human being of being a leader as well. So as well as a human doing measure, we have a human being measure in the organization. So there is a strong focus on being and how we be that human being piece. So hopefully that answers the question. We don't want to just be focusing on doing, because unfortunately I want to make Doug do, if Doug reports to me and I want to make Doug do something, I can actually do all sorts of nasty things to Doug. I can threaten him, I can keep him back, I can burn him at the weekend, I can do all sorts of things. He will probably do the job because he's probably worried about losing his job and whatever that might be. But the reality is, will he do it? Will he understand why he's doing it? Will he be part of it? Will he be brought into the process of doing it? Will he look after the guest as well? Very important things. So having a being measure is absolutely critical for me.
Well, I completely agree. I think we've run over time, and we're beginning. I think we can save the other questions and find a way of responding to them. And I love what you've described, Andrew, because as you know, a big part of our work is attached to this. Is about, we've been focusing for 50-60 years on behavior and developing competencies, descriptions of what we want people to do, forgetting that the way we approach work determines what we do. So we don't ask the why question often enough, and that's something you've addressed in this session. That's brilliant. So thank you for this insightful presentation. I support what Monica said. You're always inspiring, always leaving us with something to think about. My personal takeaways from today are three things. Firstly, absolutely what we just said, knowing is easy. But especially today, you know, when I started work, if I wanted to know something, it would take me forever. I'd have to go to a library. I'd have to go and find a book in a bookshop about it. Now I Google and it's just there. But taking knowledge and applying that knowledge is really the challenge. It's the key. So how and why, as we've just said, why something works is every bit as important as what. And I think in terms of people and organizational development, we've got to start moving beyond just thinking about behavior and competencies. Then the second one is, I love that idea of hearing, respecting, acknowledging and remembering. The starter said, it's wonderful when you hear people take what could be a complex issue of communications and boil it down to 4 key things. Once we can remember that, we can do something about that. And these are critical as we embed learning cultures in organizations. You could describe them as the 4 pillars of engagement. And that is changing over time. I remember when I first started work, so I'm telling people how old I am, obedience was one of the key qualities you used to look for in people. I've not heard that word for years. So, and then finally, we mustn't lose focus on the 4 levers of human engagement. So, you know, we talk about want, can, should, and must. And it's critical that learning is focused on can. It's accessible. I love the idea of the nibble-sized learning. And it should be focused on should. Why is it important for me? And I can't just soak in stuff like a sponge. I need what I need. And then want is very much a personal choice. Must, well, that's generally a waste of time and money. You know, I still find people do one size fits all approaches. It's incredibly a waste of money. So we know that learners also quickly forget what we need them to understand and apply. And, you know, we also were beginning, I think, to see the end of, say, 5-day workshops, because you can't remember what you did on the first day and at the end of the 5th day. So, you know, and so on. So you've given us quite a lot to think about. So thank you for joining us today and being part of International Leadership Week 2021. There is an opportunity for our audience to engage with further discussions on our website. You can go to www.institutelm.com and please access the hub. Alternatively, please use the hashtag on social posts. That's hashtag ILW21. That's hashtag ILW21. So thank you to everyone, especially to you, Andrew, and goodbye.
Thanks, Doug.